I'm going to say something that's undeniably true. Many of you are going to miss the point. Let's see if you fall into the trap. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is just a theory. There, I said it. How do you feel right now? Maybe you reacted the way that Richard Dawkins reacted in his 2006 documentary, The Root of All Evil.
It's still called the theory of evolution.
Well, it's called that, but that's in
It's
a very
not called-
technical sense.
But still, it's called that, and it's not called the law of evolution.
Well, I will call it the fact of evolution.
Well, if you did, you fell into the trap. Why? Because you've been well trained. You've been taught to think in a very specific way that leads your thinking astray. That way of thinking misdirected your attention away from asking the one question that could get us onto the same page, that could get us to a place where we could find common ground. Did you spot the question you should have asked? That question is this: what do you mean by a theory? Perhaps you didn't ask that question because you thought you already knew what I meant. You took one piece of information about me and used it to form a model of who I must be. Maybe you looked at the yarmulke on my head or the religious books on the shelves behind me, and that helped you come to the conclusion that you came to. So, what do I mean by theory? If you've been listening carefully, you might already see where this is headed. A theory is an abstraction, a framework for answering questions about some aspect of the world. You put in questions, it spits out answers. Yet, those answers, though they might technically be right or true, are more often than not woefully incomplete. Relying on theory means we have all too much confidence in the answers we've reached. And sometimes, those answers lead us very far astray. The theory of evolution glosses over thousands, perhaps millions of details to get us from point A to point B with the greatest of ease. Whether or not the process is true is besides the point. The point is that it leaves nearly the entire process unaccounted for. Let me show you with an example from the past. In 2004, paleontologists found a fossil called Tiktaalik on Ellesmere Island, Canada. And they claimed it was the missing link between fish and four-legged animals. It's got gills and scales like a fish, but a crocodile-like skull and fins with bones that look half like limbs. A snapshot of life moving from water to land. The theory of evolution sums this up in a neat little story. Random mutations in fish, DNA, filtered by natural selection in muddy, shallow waters, led to Tiktaalik over millions of years. A tidy little tail of fins turning into legs. You put in questions, it spits out answers. That story might be true or it might be false, but one thing is undeniable. It skips nearly every detail. A complete account of how a fish became a Tiktaalik would take millions of pages, a messy, jumbled list of facts impossible to connect. To give you a taste of what the rest of the details look like, you'd need the full DNA of Tiktaalik and of its fishy ancestor just to get started. That information is long lost to the ravages of time. From there, you would need to consider every fish, every gene, and every event over millions of years. You'd also need to know the details that science can't possibly fathom, such as why one fish chose this mate over that one, or why another fish chose the meal he did instead of eating an ancestor of our Tiktaalik. I don't blame paleontologists for simplifying a complex process that happened 375 million years ago. The shortcuts are necessary to make any sense of it. The problem happens when we apply that same method to things that are happening right now and right in front of us. As a public intellectual, as a person who is tasked with the popularization of science, Richard Dawkins should be modeling strong thinking. But he's so used to theorizing about masses of missing information that he's convinced he knows what's going on in other people's heads. What is it that's going through the heads of ordinary people with whom Richard Dawkins disagrees? He uses his theory to reason it out.
The suicide bomber is convinced that in killing for his God, he will be fast-tracked to a special martyr's heaven. This isn't just a problem of Islam. In this program, I want to examine that dangerous thing that's common to Judaism and Christianity as well. The process of non-thinking called faith.
You put in questions, it spits out answers. These religious believers embody faith over reason, and faith normalizes irrational belief. Irrational belief can justify any action, including violence. Therefore, even gentle faith is the start of a path towards violent extremism. The logic, of course, is severely flawed, but it takes him where he wants to go, from ordinary peaceful religious belief to the flourishing of violent extremism that can justify a crackdown on religion in general.
It looks lovely, doesn't it? Inoffensive and gentle. But isn't this the beginning of that slippery slope that leads to young men with rucksack bombs on the tube?
This mental trick would have been laughable if it was not the blueprint for an idea that became widespread in its use, not just in our opinion of our neighbors, but in justifying government action taken against them. Looking at Dawkins' documentary with the hindsight of history, we can clearly see, in its opening words, a foreshadowing of a tactic that has become terrifyingly common today, painting the toleration of views he considers harmful as an existential threat.
There are would-be murderers all around the world who want to kill you and me and themselves because they're motivated by what they think is the highest ideal.
The tactic is not a new one. Students of Jewish history will see that blueprint Dawkins helped to popularize is a modern take on one that is very old indeed. If we imagine ourselves back to ancient Judea during the 1st century CE, at the end of the Second Temple era, we find a cauldron of mutual hatred. Religious difference played a role, but that wasn't the full story. The real issue was Rome, a brutal, real, and undeniable existential threat. When Rome razed Carthage in 146 BCE, according to legend, they salted the earth to make sure the city never returned. Rome had destroyed Corinth, crushed Numantia, devastated Epirus. One by one, it destroyed the nations that fell under its heel. What should the Jews do? Endure subjugation, revolt, escape? Even in the face of a real existential threat, the Talmud takes us to task for the Jewish people's failures in the struggle against Rome, but not for losing to the Romans, but for how we treated each other, for the baseless hatred that flourished between brother and brother, for how even the rabbis were complicit in this hatred. In the end, the Romans exiled us. But Josephus and the Talmud tell the same tragic truth. We destroyed ourselves before the Romans finished the job. How? By finding evil where we could have seen good, by assuming the worst about our own people, by imagining we knew what was in their hearts. Josephus tells us how during the siege of Jerusalem, faction leaders suspected one another of treacherous collusion with the Romans over disagreements on how to deploy defensive resources. Accusations of secret collaboration to surrender Jerusalem for personal gain or mere survival destroyed any possibility of unified defense. Brutal street battles between the factions triggered famine and chaos, weakening the Jewish resistance and hastening Rome's victory, all because faction leaders knew what was on the minds of others. Destroying the possibility of cooperation, turning potential allies into enemies. The belief that we use our theories to know what's on the minds of others has left devastation in its wake. That didn't stop Richard Dawkins from resurrecting it as a tactic for social change. After Dawkins used it in his book and his documentary, the tactic made its next big appearance in the push to fundamentally transform one of the foundational institutions of civilization, marriage and family. It should be obvious that redefining marriage to include same-sex couples is a massive social experiment. Nobody could possibly have known what the results of making such a huge change would be. Even now that the courts have imposed this change on our society, the full extent of the consequences remains unknown. Ignoring potential disaster, they were monkeying around with one of the pillars that uphold society. One thing is for certain. In such a huge experiment, reasonable people could be either optimistic or pessimistic about the results. There could have been rational discussion weighing the potential costs and benefits. Activists could have assured skeptics that this one change had a logical stopping point without opening the door to further radical proposals. Or they could have negotiated, exploring alternatives acceptable to all sides. Or we simply could have recognized that America in particular, and the West in general, is the fairest and most tolerant society in human history, making the supposed necessity of redefining marriage a non-issue. The questions and challenges of rational debate were hard for the activists to meet. Rather than face those difficulties, the activists simply swept them away by applying Dawkins's tool for reading the minds with the aid of theory. With that tool, they painted a grim picture of the pessimists, starting with the assumption that redefining marriage was an unalloyed social good and that changing the laws to accommodate it was required by the Constitution. Activists used their theories to read the minds of those who opposed introducing something they portrayed as so obviously beneficial and fair.
Look, nobody's watching. It's time to spread some hate and put it in the Constitution.
Now, how?
Proposition 8!
Proposition 8! Right!
And what did they know about the opponents of marriage redefinition? That their wise and beneficial proposal could only be opposed by those who were motivated purely by the bigotry that was inspired by their incorrect and outdated religious faith. That these fanatical bigots were stuffy, uncool, and filled with hatred, willing to tell any lie necessary to make sure the world was unfair, and stayed that way. What's more, they were hypocritically misinterpreting the Bible to arrive at the unfairest possible society. Opponents of marriage redefinition were made to suffer the consequences. Photographers who refused to photograph the new ceremonies were taken to court, as were bakers who refused to make cakes celebrating same-sex unions. Even making a contribution to an organization that supported traditional marriage was enough to get Brendan Eich fired from his job as CEO of Mozilla. Hidden in that debate was a preview of what was to come. In 2008, it might have seemed outlandish that exotic forms of relations would be taught in schools, but a bit of foresight was all that it took to see how the combination of comprehensive sex education and the redefinition of marriage would lead to exactly that result, making this line from the parody bitterly ironic.
Listen to our plea. They'll teach kids about sodomy.
That wasn't right. That's a lie.
But it works, so we don't care.
Now
You see, once the courts took it upon themselves to redefine marriage, the issue went away. Yet, the activist organizations that agitated for the change did not go away. With people already mobilized and with their magical ability to read minds, they turned their eyes to the horizon to find other lands to conquer. What's more, the efforts of Dawkins and his activist imitators left religious faith weakened and a population terrified of being accused of being uncool bigots. The path was open to clown world. Not even the gloomiest of pessimists back in 2008 could have pictured what was about to come next. School libraries were stocked with books that not only gave explicit descriptions of exotic forms of relations, but with books that gave detailed instructions for how to do it and how to find partners to do the same. Teachers openly admitted online to doing exactly what the supposed bigots said they would do.
June is Pride Month, and here are some amazing books you should read to your class.
What other social changes can Dawkins' tactic be used for? Any of them. And once the trick worked, once society rewarded this new way of reading minds and labeling dissent as hate, activists didn't stop. Like a glutton at a restaurant, looking at the menu and saying, "I'll take it," they began applying the method to every social issue in sight. Some campaigns fizzled, others exploded, but the tool was the same: assume the worst, skip the argument, and claim the moral high ground. It was a tool so powerful that even Joe Biden couldn't resist its lure.
Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
Once again, you put in questions, it spits out answers. And like Dawkins before him, Biden paints the mere toleration of opposing views as an existential threat. And just like the faction leaders in Josephus' Jerusalem, that declaration justifies extraordinary measures, so long as you're convinced you know what your opponents are really thinking. In the end, Dawkins' tactic became the root of all foolishness, a tool to impose policies once considered ridiculous. Yet, here we are. Worse, these radical policies were enforced with the full power of the government, finding ways to persecute and even prosecute opponents whose evil motives and thoughts were clearly known. Here we are, at the brink of civil war. May God help us. If you like this video and want more inspiring content, why don't you click like and subscribe to my channel? Have you ever dealt with somebody who thought they had a way to read your mind? Tell me about it in the comments.